Since its introduction in 2003, the Opera line of fountain pens has been a mainstay in the stable of Italian pen maker Visconti. The unusual squaring the circle design featured on the Opera models, combined with a unique and beautiful set of materials, have made Visconti's Opera variants quite popular. In fact, the king of all fountain pen reviewers himself, Dr. S.B.R.E. Brown, helped introduce me to the brand through his effusive praise when he reviewed the Visconti Opera Elements. Through the years, Visconti has released several different models of the Opera made out of different materials and with different nibs. In 2015, Visconti released their newest iteration in the Opera line, the Opera Metal. Made from colored avonial, an aluminum alloy often used in the aeronautics industry, the Opera Metal was something of a departure for the line, which had previously featured mainly acrylics and celluloids. We'll dive into the Visconti Opera Metal in today's review and see how this new version stacks up in the venerable line. Hello everybody, welcome to The Pen Habit. My name's Matt Armstrong. I am glad to have you here for another fountain pen review video. And before I get started today, please allow me to say thank you to Aaron Ramon, who lent this pen to me, loaned for review purposes. So thank you very much, Aaron. All right, let's get into it. The pen for today's review is one of the newer versions of the Visconti Opera called the Visconti Opera Metal. This came out in late 2015. It is basically the same design as the standard Visconti Opera. It is that, as I mentioned in the intro, the squaring the circle design. So you can see here that there are four flat sides, but the corners have been rounded off, or probably a more accurate way of putting it is it used to be round and then they flattened four of the sides. So it's got both a square and a kind of rounded profile. You've got this Visconti medallion in the cap here, which can be removed and replaced with a jewel or monograms or other things like that through the My Visconti system. The body of the pen is made out of an aluminum, or if you're not from the US, aluminium alloy called avonial, and it's used a lot in the aerospace industry from what I understand. It can be colored, and so this pen is made out of two different colors of the material. So there's this silver and then there's kind of a titanium gray color on top of it, which I think provides a nice contrast. There are other versions of this pen. I know there's a black version with kind of like a lime green yellow accents and a black version with red accents. This is by far my favorite. I really like the brushed look of it. It looks kind of very modern and industrial and clean lined, which is kind of different for Visconti. Visconti's usually tend to be a little bit more showy and a little bit more brighter materials, flashier, that kind of thing. So this is pretty understated for Visconti. They do use the bridge clip here, and the bridge clip, is hinged. I know some people really don't like the Visconti bridge clip, and I will admit that on some of their pens, it's not a good fit, just design-wise, but I feel like it fits this particular design very nicely. And that bridge clip is made out of the darker titanium gray avonial as opposed to the silver stuff. And then Visconti is engraved in the side of the clip, which is pretty standard. There is a dark cap band here which says Silver Shadow, which is the name of this particular color scheme. Then the barrel tapers down to kind of a little itty-bitty point here and a darker finial. But aside from that, this pen is largely unadorned. I don't know, this is not my normal style, but I like it a lot. The cap uses Visconti's kind of hook and latch system, which is nice, got the nice spring here. Now, my mantra has become you can only review the pen you have. But when I do hear a lot of chatter about a pen in the community, I generally like to try to include that as best I can in my reviews. I have heard a few people say that the spring on this latch system sometimes doesn't work or fails. I've never seen it. It's certainly not a problem on this pen, but I have heard it a few times, enough to make me think that it might be an issue. Under the cap, you have a darker section in that darker gray material. It has this really nice brushed matte finish, and then this is a cartridge converter pen. Now, a couple things to point out here. First, you've got this nice metal tenon here. So it's metal on metal, but the threads are very smooth. There are actually what appear to be steel threads on the inside of the barrel here. So it's steel on steel as opposed to steel on aluminum, which is good because when you get two different metals, you can get some galvanization, corrosion in there, which could cause problems. So that looks like that is very well done in that particular case. Obviously, don't want to use this as an eyedropper though. With metal on metal threads and a metal body, it's probably best you just stick with a converter. It's a very, this is kind of the standard Visconti converter, nice metal knob here, kind of well-made converter. It is a screw-in converter, but I want to point something out to you here. You'll notice that I've got the ink which is kind of stuck to the top of the piston as opposed to flowing freely inside the converter. That is a problem I've had on this converter several times with a couple of different inks. If I go like this and just flick the ink, eventually the air will move up to the top and the ink will move down to the feed, but I find myself having to do that fairly regularly. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I have cleaned the converter with a little bit of dish soap, which generally is supposed to help break up some of that surface tension, rinsed it out and put more ink in it. But for some reason, the ink likes to stay kind of bubbled up to the top there, which can give the false impression of ink starvation. So if this were my pen, I would probably just use a different converter in the pen, which should resolve that issue pretty much entirely. The screw-in converter is nice though, because there's no rattling around of that metal converter, which has been a problem in some of the other Viscontis that I've taken a look at. So it's very nice in that respect. The nib is one of Visconti's what they call Smart Touch nibs. And I've talked about these nibs before. They call it the Chromium 18 Smart Touch nib. It wraps around the feed, kind of a tubular shape, and the design is supposed to help keep the feed from drying out quite as easily. You'll notice there is a slight bend to the nib to help counteract the curvature of the nib body itself, which I'll get to when I talk about the writing a little bit. One thing about the Chromium 18 Smart Touch nib, I feel like it's another one of those cases of marketing run amok. Chromium 18 is just basically a slightly different recipe for steel. It's a steel nib. So it might have a little bit more flexion to the tines, really not very much though. And again, I'll get to that when I get to the writing. But I feel like this whole Smart Touch thing is Visconti's way of trying to get away with charging more than they should for what is essentially a steel nib. That is the pen. In the hand, really nicely comfortable. It's very nicely balanced. The pen can post. It does not post deeply or well. And this is not a pen I would ever use posted. It just feels ridiculous and awkward. But without posting, very comfortable in the hand. You'll notice that the section is pretty short, and sometimes my fingers will rest on the big hook and latch channels for the cap. It doesn't bother me really all that much, so I really haven't had too many problems with it. So aside from that, very comfortable, very nice to use. I was able to use it for long writing sessions with no cramping or any of that kind of thing.
This is actually a very nice writer. The nib is, as is true with a lot of Visconti's nibs, very, very smooth. There's very little in the way of feedback. It writes really quite nicely. Now, I did mention earlier the problem with the ink flow in the converter, which will sometimes make this pen feel a little bit drier than it actually is. If that were resolved, I think this would be a pretty consistent wet writer. Once I had the ink flow issues resolved, the feed didn't choke or anything like that, so no ink starvation. Now, I like Visconti pens and have for a long time, but it seems like, according again to what I'm hearing in the community, the quality control on Visconti's nibs has gone pretty consistently downhill over the last several years. I know that I have run into problems with some of my Visconti nibs. Almost all of them have needed to be worked on in some form or another. This particular nib is actually very nice and writes really well, but it's a little over-polished and has just a little tiny bit of baby's bottom on the nib. So I do get some hard starts, especially if I tend to hold the pen at a slightly lower angle, or if I'm on a really glossy paper like this Rhodia dot pad. The nib, as I mentioned earlier, does have kind of a little turn up on the end. Not a turnip, but a turn up on the end, which makes it feel almost like a Fude nib, where, you know, if you did it higher, you get a finer line. You know, it's like if you write high, you get a fine line. If you write low, you get a wider line. It's not a full, like, curve up like a Fude nib actually is, but it feels very similar to that. Unfortunately, the baby's bottom on this it's unfortunate, because if it didn't have that baby's bottom, it would be a really, really nice, smooth, buttery writer. The baby's bottom is minor frustrating. Fortunately, it's a minor baby's bottom problem, one that if this were my pen, I could resolve really quickly and easily. As a reverse writer, it is actually quite nice, very fine line. There is a little bit of line variation. I'm not pushing very hard because, again, it's not my pen, but you can see a little bit of slight line variation here if you do this. However, what you'll get more of is the ink flow variation. So if you've got a nice shading ink like this Papier Plume moss green is, then you'll see that in the, when you put a little bit of pressure on the nib. It is, as I mentioned, a nice wet nib, although not overtly so. It is a medium line, and it is a pretty consistent Western style medium line, but it's, it puts down a nice amount of ink, not too much. I'd say it's a little on the wet side of moderate, but not significantly on the wet side of moderate. Aside from that, it's just a nice writer. It's comfortable in the hand, as I mentioned. I can do long writing sessions with it, no problem, as I did when I wrote the written review of this pen and a couple of letters. A little bit of baby's bottom on the nib, but nothing that is too terrible. And aside from that, everything else is really quite nice about this pen. The Visconti Opera Metal has a list price of $650 US. It retails for less than that, and just looking, it looks like around $580, $585, even though that's not the price that they will show you if you look on the website. That's, it's one of those things where Visconti likes to hide their actual price, which I just loathe. But I've gone on about that in the past before. They hide their actual price, but it comes out to about $585. Now, y'all know I don't mind paying a lot for a pen. Clearly, you've seen my previous videos, chances are. $585 for this particular pen seems like way too much to me, particularly when the nib had a few issues, it's a cartridge converter pen, and it's a steel nib. I'm sorry, but $600 for a steel nibbed pen is just too much, unless there's something really, really special about the pen itself. And as much as I like this pen and the way it fits in the hand, there's not enough special about it, to me, to justify a price that high. There just really isn't. It's a really nice pen. I really like it. If they were to knock a couple $100 off the pen, this is a pen I think I would probably even want to own.
but at the current price point, it's just too expensive for what you get, in my opinion. Well, that should do it for this review of the Visconti Opera Medal. Another huge thank you to Aaron for lending me this pen for review purposes. I really do appreciate it. This will be back on its way to you soon, Aaron. Actually, by the time this views, you will have probably had it back for a couple months, because this probably won't review for a couple months until after I record it. So, as always, you can head over to penhabit.com to see the written review and extra photos. Leave comments there at penhabit.com or on YouTube. I will try to get back to you as best I can. You can reach me penhabit@gmail.com via email or on the various social media hangouts. And of course, don't forget to check on penhabit.com's web store for pens that I have up for sale and the currently inked notebook, the Inky Fingers notebook line, including the currently inked log, which has been very popular. So thank you so much for watching, and we will see you here next time on The Pen Habit. Bye.